Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Charter for Compassion Global Read. This is a special global read for September 11th. I'm getting some feedback. I hope that it's okay at your end. It seems to have gone away. Each month we have a global read, and it's been fairly exciting over the last number of months. And we hope that you take advantage of these free global reads as an opportunity to keep up with some of the wonderful writings that are going on in the world. We try and get our themes for the global reads to correspond with the 12 sectors of the Charter. And over the last months, we've had Daniel Goldman, A Force for Good. You might know that Daniel is the author of Emotional Intelligence. A number of months ago, we had Robin DiAngelo with White Fragility. Most recently, we had Michael Nagler, who will be joining us again on September 21st to share with us not only his writings that he has done a number of times, but a brand new documentary that he's been involved in. And we've also recently had Joanna Macy with her book, A Wild Love for the World. And so today we have Billy Collins, and Billy is probably most known for being Poet Laureate twice. He'll probably mention that in conversation because I've seen him in readings a number of times, and somehow it just kind of always comes up. And you know, it's quite an honor. And he's being joined in conversation by Olivia Sears, and we're excited about having Olivia with us as well. The three of us have something in common, and that something is a someone, Cynthia Sears. And Cynthia has been a real supporter to the Charter of Compassion for a number of years, but she's the reason that we know one another. And so, you know, I'm excited, and, you know, it seems as if we should say this whole session is dedicated to Cynthia because she's been so loyal, probably in each of our lives. And I know that she is listening. And originally I had asked her if she would be the facilitator today because she knows Billy so well. And she just looked at me and she said, no way. And I said, well, you know, would Olivia, who happens to be Cynthia's daughter, she would be willing to do this? And she said, I think she would be thrilled. And we're thrilled that Olivia is here. And you know, Olivia is quite a formidable force in her own way. She's the founder of the Center for the Art of Translation, and before that, a wonderful journal called Two Lines. And I think I started reading Two Lines before I even connected that Olivia was Cynthia's daughter. She's also on the advisory board of the Center for Writers and Translators in Paris. She has a long list of accolades, and I'm going to let her maybe talk a little bit about herself and the Center for the Art of Translation. And my hope is that you know, we're going to be able to work a little bit more with Olivia next year in having some incredible international authors, as well as Olivia is a great translator from Italian of poetry, which in itself is a fine art. So I'm going to turn this over to Olivia now, and we'll take it from there, and she'll introduce Billy along the way.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. I'm so delighted to be here. My mother was right. I'm absolutely delighted to participate with the Charter. The Charter of Compassion is such an incredible organization. And of course, to introduce Billy, and I will introduce Billy in a moment, but I did want to tell you a little bit about the Center for the Art of Translation, as long as I'm here. We're a nonprofit organization that champions literary translation, but not only that, we're dedicated to finding new voices, those dazzling, overlooked, and underrepresented voices from around the world, brought into English by the best translators. We published some really fantastic books you can see behind me, and an amazing journal online. And we believe these enrich the library of vital literary works in English. We also hold some really fascinating events. Even before COVID, we did a lot of virtual events, frequently across multiple time zones, again, to nurture and promote the work of writers and translators around the world. And we also teach poetry translation in the schools, honoring the incredible linguistic and cultural diversity of our school and encouraging future readers. And this has a lot to do with compassion, I think. You've probably heard about the studies of empathy that concluded that literary fiction improves a reader's capacity to understand what others are thinking and feeling. And of course, that effect only increases in importance when the others that the reader is empathizing with are on the other side of the world, speak an other language, perhaps practice an other religion. So reading fiction is like a training course in understanding others. One psychologist calls it the mind's flight simulator. So I'm not a social scientist and I can't vouch for the veracity of those studies, but we've seen the powerful impact of the written word also in our education program, Poetry Inside Out, that in fact relies on cultural and linguistic differences in the classroom, and thus celebrates diversity and cross-cultural literacy. Translators like to say that translation is the closest form of reading there is. You have to deeply understand a work before you can translate it. And we found that student translations really reflect profound responses to language, society, and one another's personal experiences. I'm just going to highlight one of our books because it came out this week, and this is my promo. It's called Home. And from the beginning, we have always wanted to deliver something other than what people expect. So this collection is a book of poetry from Arabic, and so much of what we experience of the Arab world through the media involves violence, war, suffering, conflict, and it's a way in which we see people as other. And this is a collection that is rooted in the course of daily life, in the humanity. And I'm just going to read the very start of the description. Evoking the sights, sounds, and tastes of contemporary life, the poems in Home explore the intimate world of the everyday, its agonies and delights, through work from 9 poets from 8 different countries, rendered masterfully into English by today's leading Arabic translators. So I encourage you to come look at our website at catranslation.org. We have lots of free literature on the website, and join us in our community. And with that, I will now introduce our guest, Billy Collins. Billy Collins is the author of 12 collections of poetry. That may sound like a pretty high volume of volumes, but that's not what makes Billy so unusual as a poet. He is not your typical poet. His readings regularly sell out. He receives advances for his books, and many of them become bestsellers. These are all words that never arise in the poetry world other than around Billy. He served 2 terms, as Marilyn said, as the U.S. Poet Laureate, and he was also the New York State Poet Laureate. In 2002, as U.S. Poet Laureate, Billy was asked to write a poem commemorating the first anniversary of the fall of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center on September 11th. The reading was in front of a joint session of Congress held outside of Washington, D.C. We're now going to hear the poem called The Names, and then we'll have a brief discussion about the writing of the poem. Billy.
Okay. Very good. Just clear my throat here. Hi, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be the guest of the Charter for Compassion, which is a wonderful name. The name itself would get me to read. And thank you for that introduction, Olivia, and I look forward to talking to you. So yes, I want to read the poem. I don't read the poem very often, I wanted to say. I published, I think, maybe 3 books of poems after I'd written the names, and I didn't put the names in any of those books. And I had a rather big book out called Nameless Love, which is a new and selected. And I put the names in the last poem in there. I thought it should be published, but I'm happy to read it on this occasion. It's dedicated to the victims of September 11th and their survivors. The names. Yesterday, I lay awake in the palm of the night. A fine rain stole in, unhelped by any breeze. And when I saw the silver glaze on the windows, I started with Ackerman as it happened, then Baxter and Calabro, Davis and Eberling, names falling into place as droplets fell through the air. Names printed on the ceiling of the night, names slipping around a watery bend, 26 willows on the banks of a stream. In the morning, I walked out barefoot among thousands of flowers, heavy with dew, like the eyes of tears, and each had a name, Fiore, inscribed on a yellow petal, then Gonzalez and Hahn, Ishikawa and Jenkins, names written in the air and stitched into the cloth of the day, a name under a photograph taped to a mailbox, monogram on a torn shirt. I see you spelled out on storefront windows and on the bright unfurled awnings of this city. I say the syllables as I turn a corner, Kelly and Lee, Medina, Nardella, and O'Connor. When I peer into the woods, I see a thick tangle where letters are hidden, as in a puzzle concocted for children. Parker and Quigley in the twigs of an ash, Rizzo, Schubert, Torres, and Upton, secrets in the boughs of an ancient maple. Names written in the pale sky, names rising in the updraft amid buildings, names silent in stone or cried out behind a door, names blown over the earth and out to sea. In the evening, weakening light, the last swallows, a boy on a lake lifts his oars. A woman by a window puts a match to a candle, and the names are outlined in the rose clouds, Vanacore and Wallace. Let X stand, if it can, for the ones unfound. Then Young and Zeminski, the final jolt of Z. Names etched on the head of a pin, one name spanning a bridge, another undergoing a tunnel, a blue name needled into the skin. Names of citizens, workers, mothers, and fathers, the bright-eyed daughter, the quick son. Alphabet of names in green rows in a field, names in the small tracks of birds, names lifted from a hat or balanced on the tip of the tongue. Names wheeled in to the dim warehouse of memory, so many names, there is barely room on the walls of the heart. And that's the names.
So it's very difficult to follow a poem like that with a conversation, but I'd love to hear what it was like for you to be asked at that moment to write a poem, and how you went about it and how you thought about it.
Right. Well, it was a form of paralysis when I was asked to do it. I got a phone call from Congress, not all of them at once, but I think from a committee that was staging this event. And I was appointed poet laureate, and yes, this does come up, as Marilyn said, about two and a half months before 9/11. And so I was sort of in the hot seat. People were, NPR and other news outlets were calling and asking for a poem and what the laureate thinks about all this. And when I got the call from Congress asking me as poet laureate to write a poem for this occasion, the almost unprecedented gathering of both houses of Congress in New York City, the location of 9/11. Well, Olivia, you know what my poems are about, more or less. I mean, they're walking the dog or looking out the window at a robin biting a worm. They're about small, trivial things. And the subject itself, I mean, the monumentality of it, the unprecedented joining of jet planes and architecture, it was just too staggering. So I told them that I wouldn't. I didn't think I could. I think I would lose my voice or strain my voice, if you know what I mean, taken out of that zone. And of course, I said I'd be honored to be part of the ceremony, and I'll find a poem by someone else. I was thinking of probably Whitman. Well, there was a great silence on the other end of the telephone. They're getting a no from the laureate. But, and I don't want to make this too long, but I think it was a couple of weeks later that I woke up much earlier than usual. It was still dark. And I think it was probably the voice of my mother saying, "Get off the bench," you know. So I lay in bed thinking about it. How could I write something? And two things came to mind. I realized I could write an elegy, which would just be within the genre, simply a poem for the deceased, for the victims. And that would avoid the subject of geopolitical unrest and terrorism. And by the way, the phone call from the Congress people, they started suggesting things that should be in this poem that I was not writing. Like, could you say something about the first responders? Could you say something hopeful about the future of the country? The more they talked, the more I realized I couldn't write that poem, and that's what they wanted. At any rate, I realized two things. I could write an elegy for the victims, and that I could use the alphabet of the names to kind of have handholds to get me through the poem as a way of organizing it. And the other kind of organization that just came naturally to it was, it takes place in the course of a day. It begins lying in bed at night, and then there's the morning, and finally we get to evening. So it sort of has a chronological order to it also, that what made it easier to follow. So I got up that morning out of bed and armed with those two restrictions, wrote the poem in a couple of hours. And as I was writing, I would just guess the names. I didn't want to leave them blank. So for A, I'd say Adams or whatever. And out of the 26 names, I had about 7 of the real names. But then I saw the list and I filled them in. And there were names for every letter except X. And there's a parenthesis in the poem, and there's a pause, and let X stand if it can for those unfound. I had to do something with X, so that was a slight technical problem. Anyway, that's sort of the way it got written.
So you mentioned that you rarely perform this poem. So what has it been like, or when have you performed it, and what has been the response to it?
Well, I've only performed it on 9/11. I think there's been maybe 1 or 2 exceptions to that I'm not thinking of. But I didn't want to make it part of my repertoire. You know, I didn't want to put it in. As you said, I do a lot of readings, and I didn't want to make it, you know, now I'm going to play or read the name. So I didn't read it on many occasions, and was very restricted. I didn't want to just make it another poem of mine. It's very special for me.
So what was it like when you first read it, when you read it to Congress?
Well, that was, my heart was jumping all over the place. I mean, I was incredibly nervous. And it's very odd. Well, a couple of things. It's very odd to see all those faces, most of which you see on television, of senators and representatives, and you can recognize many of them. So the audience was formidable, and they weren't there to hear a poetry reading either. It was not a poetry crowd, so I couldn't rely on that. I looked around. Well, when I began reading it, the poem starts something about, last night I lay in the palm of the night and it's raining out, right? Something like that. And as I've said, many of the people in Congress kind of cock their heads like a cocker spaniel, like, hearing a whistle. They didn't know what are you talking about? This is supposed to be immoral. You're talking about lying in bed and it's raining out. And I was using the language of poetry, which is the language of imagery. Emerson talks about the speaking language of things, and I was using those things. But it just pointed out not the quality of the poem, but it pointed out the difference between political language and poetic language. And there were plenty of speeches before and after my reading of the poem. And for all their best efforts, the language is fairly recycled. It was about history and courage and this and that. So anyway, it was frightening, but I got through it okay. And Senator Moynihan was at the edge of his seat. That really meant a lot to me. He was really paying attention. He knew what it was. It was a poem.
Of course.
Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience. If you have written any pandemic poems that you could share.
Well, I wrote a very short one, and I don't have it on hand here. It was I was asked by I forget the name of the society, but they put poems in lots of public places, and I wrote a little poem called Nurse. And it was just based on, it's only 5 or 6 lines long, and it was a nurse who said that she caught herself as she stumbled into fatigue, envying the dead because they look like sleepers in their beds. And they projected this on the wall of a hospital outside of San Francisco, the Kindred Hospital. And so it was at night, it was on the walls of that hospital. It's so hard to speak for a pandemic or a terrorist attack. The subject matter is, I certainly don't want to be presumptuous about, being a spokesperson for something I'm totally ignorant of and I haven't suffered from. But this one nurse, I thought I could speak for her, let her speak for herself in a way.
That's really interesting to when you're faced with something that's so enormous, to ground it in an image or a person or something tangible. I just wanted to ask one more question about this kind of thing. I see that the next Global Reads is going to be Sharon Salzberg, and I heard her speak recently. And she says, in today's fractured world, we're constantly flooded with breaking news that cause anger, grief, and pain. People are feeling more stressed out than ever. And in the face of this fear and anxiety, they can feel so burnt out and overwhelmed that they end up frozen in their tracks. And she's talking about a meditation practice that encourages social change. And I'm wondering how you, as a poet, balance the kind of openness that you have to have in order to be a poet, to see those things that distract you and take you down, a garden path, and to reflect the world without becoming overwhelmed by all these different entities. And
well, I feel overwhelmed and I feel caged in a way. I mean, we went to a restaurant, my wife and I, last week. We hadn't been to a restaurant since March. That kind of sheltering, but also I'm a writer. I can read and write during the day, and so there's not that kind of confinement. But my antidote to all this was suggested by my wife, and on March 23rd, the day after my birthday, I've never done any Facebook work or social media. But she suggested that if I could go on Facebook and read a poem or two. And so it's called the Poetry Broadcast. I do it every weekday at 5:30. The first one was 8 minutes long, and now it's grown to about a half an hour. And I play some jazz at the beginning, at the end. And I have two roles. One is I'm the poet, but when I talk about jazz, I turn into Professor Bebop, and that's my jazz look. But so we've got thousands of people in so many countries, Olivia. And I mean, just as a metaphor for the span of it, one of our listeners is a woman who she gets into bed in Paris and goes to sleep listening to it. And another woman in Australia listens with her breakfast, so it's all over the place. And people are very, very thankful because at the very first, I told them, and I repeat this, these are not poems of solace. I'm not trying to comfort anybody, but we're never going to talk about the news. We're just going to talk about poetry. I wrote a poem for them called The Minor Third, which we got into a conversation about music. And we'll talk about all sorts of things, about dogs and clouds. And that gives me a balancing act, because every day at 5:30, and I start thinking about it maybe at about 4, and I try to get some kind of theme together. I have something to do every weekday, so it's almost like going to work, but it's incredibly pleasant and very rewarding. And as I said, the audience, it loves the oasis that I've created away from the headlines.
That is fantastic, and that's a wonderful thing to share with the audience here. So I think we'll all be tuning in at 5:30. That's 5:30 Eastern, right?
5:30 Eastern time, and it's just on weekdays, yeah.
Excellent. Well, with that, let's hear some more of your poems, and then we can talk more afterwards.
Okay, well, very good. Well, you did a little promo there. I have a new book coming out on September 29th, and it's called Whale Day, and that's the rather startling cover there with a flying whale. And I'm going to start by reading a few poems from Whale Day. And this one is called, by the way, I love Flight Simulator. I'm going to steal that to describe poems. That's very good. The first one is called Walking My 75-Year-Old Dog. She's painfully slow, so I often have to stop and wait while she examines some roadside weeds, as if she were reading the biography of a famous dog. And she's not a pretty sight anymore, dragging one of her hind legs, her coat too matted to brush or comb, and a snout white as a marshmallow. We usually walk down a disused road that runs along the edge of a lake, whose surface trembles in a high wind and is slow to ice over as the months grow cold. We don't walk very far before she sits down on her worn haunches and looks up at me with her rheumy eyes. Then it's time to carry her back to the car. Just thinking about the honesty in her eyes, I realize I should tell you, she's not really 75, she's 14. I guess I was trying to appeal to your sense of the bizarre, the curiosities of the sideshow. I mean, who really cares about another person's dog? Everything else I've said is true, except the part about her being 14. I mean, she's old, but not that old, and it's not polite to divulge the true age of a lady. Here's one. Two things I've always wanted to do: play jazz piano. I do that really, really, really badly, and speak Italian, and I do that really, really badly. But this is a poem called I Am Not Italian. I am not Italian, technically speaking, yet here I am leaning on a zinc bar in Perugia on a sunny weekday morning, my foot up on the worn iron railing, just like the other men who, it must be said, are officially and fully Italian. It's 8:40 and they're off to work, some in offices, others sweeping the streets, while I am off to a museum or a church to see paintings, maybe light a candle in an alcove. Yet here we all are in our suits and work shirts, joined in the brotherhood of espresso, or how is it said, la fratellanza dell'espresso, draining our little white cups with an artful rotation of the wrist, each of us tasting the same sweetness of life, if you take a little sugar, and the bitterness of its brevity, whether you choose to take sugar or not. And I'd like to dedicate this poem particularly to my dear friend and your dear mother, Cynthia Sears. And this is called the Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende. The Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende is not made up of the usual instruments. Instead of brass, strings, and woodwinds, there are church bells, roosters, doves, and barking dogs, all of which predate the horn, the violin, and the oboe, notably the rooster who crowed even before the time of Christ. The orchestra plays all day and into the night, but the music is most alive in the early morning when much of the audience is half asleep and not distracted by their jobs and errands as they will be later in the day. At first, as I listened from my canopied bed, it sounded like a jumble of noise, until I imagined a gigantic score written centuries ago by the Mozart of Mexico, the genius who decided those dogs should come in just after the 32 gongs of a solemn bell, who had the doves modulate into an adagio, and who added a rest here and there where the roosters should pause, but not for long. Are we not seekers of order, I thought, as when we follow the lines in our palms or connect the dots of the stars to form a bear in the sky? So before rising from our slumberous beds, why not listen a little longer to this composition for dogs, roosters, doves, and bells? The dogs are barking to be fed. The roosters are beckoning us to the hen house where 3 eggs are still warm in the straw. But the doves are mourning our awful losses, and the bells are here to remind us of God. So that's, Cynthia was a great lover of San Miguel. So maybe a couple more. This is a poem from a recent book called The Rain in Portugal. It's got nothing to do with Portugal or rain, but it's just it's like a trigger warning telling you that I'm not a very good rhymer. The Rain in Portugal. Fewer things rhyme with Portugal than they do with rain. And here's a poem called Only Child. You know who you are out there if you are an only child. And 2 things I've heard about being an only child. One is that we are better receivers of love than givers of love. Our receptors are out, but we're not initiating. And the other thing is that the only child is a really bad liar. And the reason is that we have no siblings to blame stuff on. You can't say like, no, Joey knocked over the vase. It's on you. You're the only one there. But there are joys of being an only child. Only child. I never wished for a sibling, boy or girl. Center of the universe, I had the back of my parents' car all to myself. I could look out one window, then slide over to the other window without any quibbling over territorial rights. And whenever I played a game on the floor of my bedroom, it was always my turn. Not until my parents entered their 90s did I long for a sister, a nurse I named Mary, who worked in a hospital 5 minutes away from their house, and who would drop everything, even a thermometer, whenever I called. Be there in a jiff and on my way were 2 of her favorite expressions. And now that the parents are dead, I wish I could meet Mary for coffee every now and then at that Italian place with the blue awning, where we would sit, and reminisce, even on rainy days. I would gaze into her green eyes and see my parents, my mother looking out of Mary's right eye, and my father staring out of her left, which would remind me of what an odd duck I was as a child, a little prince and a loner who would break off from his gang of friends on a Saturday to find a hedge to hide behind. And I would tell Mary all about that too, and never embarrass her by asking about her non-existence. And maybe we would have another espresso and a pastry, and I would always pay the bill and walk her home. And I think I'll read one more poem and then we can have a chat if you like. And I did want to read a poem for Marilyn, who is this, the straw stirring this drink, so to speak. And the title of the poem is The Revenant, and the Revenant is someone from the other side who comes back to haunt you, or maybe just pay you a visit. The Revenant. I am the dog you put to sleep, as you like to call the needle of oblivion. Come back to tell you this simple thing. I never liked you, not one bit. When I licked your face, I thought of biting off your nose. When I watched you toweling yourself dry, I wanted to leap and unman you with a snap. I resented the way you moved, your lack of animal grace, the way you would sit in a chair to eat, a napkin on your lap, a knife in your hand. I would have run away, but I was too weak, a trick you taught me while I was learning to sit and heal and, greatest of insults, shake hands without a hand. I admit the sight of the leash would excite me, but only because it meant I was about to smell things you had never touched. You do not want to believe this, but I have no reason to lie. I hated the car, hated the rubber toys, disliked your friends, and worse, your relatives. The jingling of my tags drove me mad. You always scratched me in the wrong place. All I ever wanted from you was food and fresh water in my metal bowls. While you slept, I watched you breathe as the moon rose in the sky. It took all of my strength not to raise my head and howl. Now I am free of the collar, free of the yellow raincoat, monogram sweater, the absurdity of your lawn. And that is all you need to know about this place, except what you already supposed and are glad it did not happen sooner, that everyone here can read and write. The dogs in poetry, the cats and all the others in prose. So I'm sure your dog loved you, but so maybe
Yeah,
give
that's
us something.
wonderful. Thank you for sharing all those poems.
You're welcome.
I was wondering if you could talk a little. I noticed that Italy came up a fair amount in your in these poems and in general. And you mentioned about speaking Italian. I'm wondering if you could talk about, since this is the global read, if you could talk about your relationship with translators who translate your poetry around the world, and of course, especially Italian. But what that's like and how you go about that with your translators.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to be honored by a number of translators, and maybe I think perhaps into maybe 13 or 15 languages. I think one or two of those languages, I don't even know what language it is because the alphabet is completely different and there's no English word in the text at all to go by. I think I asked my dry cleaner because I thought he was Albanian, but it turns out he wasn't. So that backfired, actually. Well, my tightest relationship is with my Italian translator, a wonderful guy named Franco Nasi, and he teaches at the University of Modena, yeah, in in northern Italy, where Ferraris are made. And he's a very dedicated translator, and he's very interested in impossible translation, like the blind stitch, you know, the translation that would drive you crazy, like translating Jabberwocky, translating James Joyce, this kind of, or Finnegan's Wake. He loves this sort of impossibility of doing that. So, and I've worked with him, and I've worked with my two Spanish translators and two Portuguese translators. And by email, we go back and forth. And if there's a difficult passage, if you know, the word draft comes up, I mean, language, you realize when you're working with a translator how difficult translation is, and what a difficult language English is to translate, because it's so idiomatic. So is draft what happens when you're forced to go in the army, or is draft what's on your shoulders and you need to close the window? You know, I mean, things like that. And so it's so refreshing to be able to help someone with that. But with Franco Nassi, I've been to Italy twice, and we've toured around, the two of us, reading in everywhere from his university to a coffee shop to a little theater, mostly in northern Italy, but driving around. And I will read in English, and he will read in Italian. And it's just wonderful for the two to be on stage with the man who's devoted so much attention. When we went through the poems in the beginning, I said to him, you know, some of these poems are so American that I don't know if you can translate them. I said, I have a poem called The Lanyard, and it's about what children make in the summertime at camp using these little bits of gimp, they're called, and weaving together. And he said, no, we have this in Italy, in Europe, but in Italy, we don't say lanyard, we say Scooby-Doo. You know, what? And so when we would be on stage, you know, he would be saying, Scooby-Doo. Wait a minute, I didn't say that. So out of tune with the poem. Anyway, it's two things to be translated. I think the highest honor you can have, actually, to be carried not just into another language, but into another culture and a whole set of new readers. On the other hand, you go on blind faith. I mean, I know Italian enough to see if things are really off, but in other languages that I'm external to, you don't know it's being what havoc or misunderstanding is being wreaked on your poetry. You just have to hope for the best. You'll never know. So it's kind of you feel ignorant and honored at the same time.
Do you know if your translators have ever communicated with one another?
I try to keep them separate. You know, it's kind of like you're. I would say to my wife and my girlfriend, but my wife's in the next room. So. And she said, "What?"
There are some authors who like to convene all of their translators in one place so that they can discuss or do it, you know, virtually on a website. So that would be interesting if you could collect all of the translations of Lanyard. I've learned something today because it has never come up in an Italian poem, and I did not know the word for lanyard in Italian. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I would think that would be a kind of a small and confusing example of the Tower of Babel.
Yes, exactly.
13 different translators together. But what are you thinking about?
I have another question from the audience, from an Italian. How do you picture which of life's little moments represent the human condition for you? When I think of Italy, there are so many sources of inspiration. The espresso cup is the perfect bittersweet morning drink that brings Italians together.
Good. Well, that's more of a comment, and I'm flattered to hear that. That does, I think, like the pub in Ireland and England and other places, the cafe in Italy they're very democratic places. You know, workmen and executives and children baby carriages and families. They're all kind of joined together there. And there's no place like that in America, certainly not the bar, where, you'd see children running around. So, that's what poets do. I mean, they're kind of on the lookout for, you don't want to face something, a big subject with it's better to look at something. I mean, here's a little example. I have a poem, it turned out to be an elegy for my father, but I didn't start out that way. I started writing a poem about when men used to wear hats, and it just kind of, he entered the poem. And a kid came up to me. I say kid because it was giving a reading in high school. And he said that his father just died, so very young age. And he wanted to write about that. And I told him, don't do that. Don't try to write an elegy. Write about what you do during the day. Write about skateboarding. Write about a sport you like, or a friend you like, or a girlfriend. Just write about something that you do. But listen for your father. He might want to come in the poem. He might want to like knock on the door of the poem and let him in and make that poem about him. In the beginning of the poem was just a means of getting to your father. I think Baudelaire. I think, is it Baudelaire that whose mother died and then his son Anatole died, and there are manuscript leavings. He tried to write a poem for his son, and he has the title like Elegy for Anatole, or for a son, and he never completed it. And there are lots of drafts, but I think the reason was he faced it head on instead of telling it slant, telling like entering a wave in the ocean. You don't just walk forward into it. You'll be knocked on your bathing suit. But you kind of go in at an angle. Yeah.
And I want to invite the audience to type in any questions that you have. I am keeping track of those. You have a poem, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to read, that's called On Turning 10. Do you have that handy?
Let's see.
If not, I can just read the last couple stanzas.
Okay. I should be able to find it. Hang on just one second. Here. Let's see.
One of the things
here it is. I've got it.
Okay.
Yeah. Would you like me to read it? What else could I do with it? Right. Why am I asking? Would you like me to destroy it? I started this out in a very satiric frame of mind. I wanted to make fun of, point a laughing finger at poems that lots of poets write on their birthday when it has a 0 at the end of it. And these are the poems are very serious and self-reflective, and I wanted to just kind of make fun of all of taking yourself so seriously. So I thought I'd write this poem on turning 10. On turning 10. The whole idea of it makes me feel like I'm coming down with something worse than any stomach ache or the headaches I get from reading in bad light, a kind of measles of the spirit, a mumps of the psyche, a disfiguring chickenpox of the soul. You tell me it is too early to be looking back, but that is because you have forgotten the perfect simplicity of being one and the beautiful complexity introduced by 2. But I can lie on my bed and remember every digit. At 4, I was an Arabian wizard. I could make myself invisible by drinking a glass of milk a certain way. At 7, I was a soldier. At 9, a prince. But now I am mostly at the window watching the late afternoon light. Back then, it never fell so solemnly against the side of my treehouse, and my bicycle never leaned against the garage as it does today, all the dark blue speed drained out of it. This is the beginning of sadness, I say to myself as I walk through the universe in my sneakers. It is time to say goodbye to my imaginary friends, time to turn the first big number. It seems only yesterday I used to believe that there was nothing under my skin but light. If you cut me, I would shine. But now, when I fall upon the sidewalks of life, I skin my knees, I bleed.
Thank
So
you.
I lost my satiric edge somewhere in that poem. I began to take the kid pretty seriously.
Indeed, and I think it says a lot about mourning the passing of time for everybody, but also how we attach significance to these moments. Turning 10, you know, is a second at a certain time of day, and then it's over. And I think that in the United States anyway, as a culture, we don't have a lot of rituals for saying goodbye to your imaginary friends and mourning. We have the celebration of turning 10, but there isn't really a chance to express that kind of sadness for what you've left behind. And I think, especially during COVID, watching, you know, my kids who missed graduation and everybody's birthday parties and all of the kind of, now we're contemplating no Halloween, all of the kind of rituals and events that allow us to mark the passing of time, and both for celebration and also for saying goodbye. We had to, instead of graduation, we looked through all the pictures that we had of my son at school over all the years to kind of remind ourselves of what that journey had been like and bring it to a close. Do you struggle with that at all? Do you find that, do you have ways of creating rituals that allow you to reflect on these things?
Well, I think if it doesn't sound too serious, that many poems are really attempts to find a moment to celebrate that is not a national holiday or not a birthday. It's just Tuesday. And something occurred there that you found wonderful or eye-opening, and it becomes a poem, and that poem is a celebration of a moment. And I think many poets, I don't know, Mary Oliver springs to mind, but many other poets, we could make a list, are celebrators of the ordinary moment. Pablo Neruda, Ode to My Socks, you know, just taking the little things of life and creating an ode, which is a sort of ceremonial poem. But also originally, I think poetry was probably about history. I mean, if we look back at Homer and the classics, poetry is telling the story of history. But at some point, the subject of poetry turned from history to time. And by time, I mean more specifically the romance of time. And by that, I mean we're running out of it. And by that, I mean Carpe Diem, the theme of mortality in poetry, which is probably the deepest vein running through culture to culture through time.
I read somewhere that you said, I think my work has to do with a sense that we are attempting all the time to create a logical, rational path through the day. To the left and right, there are an amazing set of distractions that we usually can't afford to follow, but the poet is willing to stop anywhere. And I'm wondering, I don't know what the lockdown is like in Florida. Now we have such terrible smoke that we couldn't go outside even if we wanted to. I wonder how you find distractions to write about, because there's so much less real life experience happening.
Right. Well, I haven't done it quite recently, but I had the habit of taking a walk every morning along this. There's a series of lakes where we are, and there's a lake just down the street, and there's a kind of a cinder path that runs around the edge of it. And so I take a walk, kind of running occasionally, run down there, and there's always something to see. There's shorebirds and other people. And I've written a number of poems that start out recounting that walk. But there's a sameness of being in the same house again and again. But I'm a poet of the window. Someone described me as an indoor nature poet, that I get over to the window, not the door, but the window. Door is a little too complicated. But looking out the window is often the posture of my persona or my speaker. And I was saying the other day, I have things to stimulate me. I mean, when I used to live in New York, I'm from New York, a trip to the Metropolitan Museum would almost always produce the beginnings of a poem. And looking through the encyclopedia as a physical book, I guess you can do this online, but paging through an encyclopedia, if something doesn't stimulate you, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't be writing the kind of things we're suggesting. But so I can, there are ways to kind of get inspired.
I think we have time for one last question. So this comes from one of our audience members. How does Billy know when he is complete with a poem? I have the habit of editing again and again a piece of writing, and it would be helpful to hear his response.
Well, revision, I would say there's not too many hard and fast rules for writing poetry, but revision should always be taking away, I think, not adding. You can put a lot of stuff in a poem, but make sure when you're revising that you're really getting rid of stuff that's not essential, that you get rid of over decoration and kind of trim the poem down. Well, I usually give up on a poem if it doesn't have a sense of travel from one place to another. And because most of my poems have this momentum, a forward rolling to them, I kind of usually know where the ending is when the rolling finds a place to stop. Often something just rides to the rescue. I have a poem about a cat, and I won't go into it, but it ends up being about Paul Revere. He was the last thing I was thinking about, but it's also being open, as you're right, being open to the ending. I mean, the ending might be trying to get into your poem, and you're too busy being dramatic about it. Somebody said that, I think Elizabeth Bishop, that in every poem there's a moment where the poem is beginning to end. You're kind of aware you've pretty much said this and that, and now you're getting to a point you're sensing where you don't want to say anymore, and they don't want to hear anymore, and a lot can go wrong there, because you can pull yourself up in your chair and go for the big climax, the big Warner Brothers ending. Better to just float at the end, float the poem a little bit, or end with an image, and just instead of ending, just leave. Chekhov doesn't end his stories, he just leaves. The characters have the same problems they had in the beginning, only a little worse.
That is a perfect ending, Billy. You have
Okay.
done it. We're just going to walk away. We just leave.
Just hit leave meeting.
Exactly. This has been such a delight. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Marilyn and everyone at the Charter for Compassion for sponsoring this and bringing it together. Yeah. And thank you to my mother, of course.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, I was gonna warn you to don't forget to thank your mother. Thank you, Cynthia. We love you.
We all do love Cynthia, and thank you, Billy, and certainly thank you, Olivia. This has been really great, starting with something that was so very profound, and to a certain extent ending with something that's very profound and meaningful. So thank you to both. And I just want to remind people, and that I'm going to share my screen, and Olivia indicated that our next reading is on September 22nd, and it is with Sharon Salzberg, Real Change. And we do hope that you'll sign up and join us for that date. The other thing is that everyone who registered for today will get a link very soon to the recording. And all of our global reads are recorded and are archived so that you can go back and listen to any of them. And you'll have the link for doing that. So thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Bye.
Great. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Olivia.
Bye.